Because after all, Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis and Haj Qassem Soleimani, General Soleimani, these were the two key figures on this planet who destroyed the ISIS regime. They were more important than anyone else. And the fact that they were murdered by the Americans right outside of the Iraqi International Airport when General Soleimani was going to visit the Iraqi Prime Minister at the invitation of the Iraqi Prime Minister. It's just so extraordinary and so outrageous for Iranians that I think that this is just a reminder among other reminders that, this is not over.
Yeah, precisely. I found it particularly outrageous and extremely egregious that Mike Pompeo had the stones to speak from Jerusalem and say that Qassem Soleimani was responsible for killing Christians all over the Middle East. I mean, I'm a Christian from the Middle East, and I don't know what the heck he is talking about. And as you just said, the Quds Force and Qassem Soleimani were instrumental in defeating and helping in the fight against ISIS, and on many occasions, which saved the lives of countless Christians. And then the United States goes ahead and assassinates him and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, this blatant act of war, this brazen act of barbarism, I mean, violating not just Iran's sovereignty, but Iraq's sovereignty. And so that's why I find that particularly egregious. And then I don't know if you had the misfortune of sitting through the DNC and RNC conventions, but just 2 nights ago, Donald Trump once again said that Qassem Soleimani was the #1 terrorist on the planet. And I'm listening to this and my jaw dropped. What are your thoughts on these kinds of comments?
Well, I have to give a sort of longer response, if it's okay. And that is that the creation of ISIS was the fault of the United States more than anyone else. I mean, ISIS initially was created in Iraq. It was the Islamic State of Iraq. I mean, it had multiple names, and it finally became the Islamic State of Iraq. And it was funded by Saudi Arabia. The Iraqi Prime Minister at the time made these accusations against the Saudi government. Then when the unrest in Syria began, and then foreign powers began to take advantage of the unrest and fund extremist forces, the ISIS created the Nusra Front for Syria. And long story short, ISIS grew, the Nusra Front also grew. Of course, ISIS, it was the Islamic State of Iraq, the Nusra Front group, and then ISIS declared that these two are one, and it would become the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS. And then, of course, the leadership in the Nusra Front refused to accept, and then Al-Qaeda, the leadership, Al-Qaeda, the leadership just said, yes, let's keep the two separate, and then ISIS broke away from Al-Qaeda. So ISIS was Al-Qaeda initially, until they broke away. And then we know from the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency document of 2012 that the Americans, they took a willful decision to support the regional regimes such as Qatar, such as Saudi Arabia, and unfortunately Turkey, Jordan, all of these countries, and Israel. They were all involved in supporting extremism, but these regimes or these governments were trying to create a Salafist entity between Syria and Iraq, which later, of course, that's where ISIS established itself. And then later on, General Michael Flynn, who was the head of that agency at during that period when this document was created, he later had an interview on Al Jazeera English, of all places, and said that the United States took a willful decision to support its allies in creating this mess. We also have, the WikiLeaks documents, Hillary Clinton's emails, the Saudis and the Qataris up to 2014 were supporting ISIS. We know from Kerry's private conversation with Syrian so-called opposition figures in the UN, when he said that the US allowed ISIS to advance on Damascus, and no one in that meeting was surprised because they all knew what was going on. The only people that didn't know was the general public, because the Western media was not saying any of this stuff. or Biden's speech at Harvard in 2014. And the list goes on. It's quite clear what the American role was. And when ISIS first was created, and as well as the other groups in Syria, Iranians and General Soleimani began to come to the support of the Syrian government to prevent the black flags from being raised over Damascus. And they did take parts of Damascus, and you know this better than I because you're Syrian.
They were a few minutes away from my family's houses in central Damascus. I mean, it's...
That's right. I've been to Syria quite often during these dark years in 2012, 13, 14. I'd go every year. I'd go 2-3 times. Basically, I would go to visit different universities or go to different cities and meet people in civil society. Once I was with a delegation that that provided aid for people, for refugees, but mostly I went just so that I would know the country. And when I'd be on television or I'd be at conferences and I'd be debating Syria, I would be able to say, look, I've been there. I've seen what's going on. So during those dark days in Syria, General Soleimani began the struggle, but people like Abu Mahdi were also helping because Iraqis were going to Syria to help Hezbollah. But this all began really in 2013. Up to 2013, it was the Syrian government that was fighting against the extremists, but tens of thousands of foreign fighters had been brought into the country. So it was only after all these tens of thousands of foreign countries had basically established themselves in Syria that the Iranians and Hezbollah and Iraqis and Afghanistanis and others, that they were all coming into the country to resist, to help the resistance against these foreign-backed extremists. So, and then the spillover went into Iraq. And, again, Obama admitted when ISIS was about to take Iraq, they advanced on Baghdad. They were very close to Baghdad. They were about to take Erbil, the Kurdish city. And Obama, when the Iraqi prime minister at the time requested help, Obama refused because he wanted to, put pressure on him to get concessions from the Iraqi government. So both in Syria and Iraq, the US government was aiding extremism, and it was using it for its own, by their own admission, for their own political purposes, letting people die so that they could get what they want. Again, in Iraq, especially Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis and General Soleimani, they began pushing back the extremists, and they were, again, the two chief people to defeat them. I don't think that the Iranians were giving the Americans any intelligence. They were probably, anything that they had, they'd be giving to the Iraqi government, and the Iraqi government would do what it wanted. But the Americans mostly would just bomb. They were not making any sacrifices, and they were very brutal in their bombing. I went with the Popular Mobilization Forces immediately after Mosul was liberated, and I filmed it when I entered the city. And it was badly damaged. And when we were touring the city, there were hundreds of people under the destroyed houses. The Americans were just literally bombing all over the place. They had bombed Mosul University. You could see the buildings on the campus destroyed. So the Americans didn't have any heroic role. They just, when they decided to turn against ISIS, they would just simply bomb them, destroy cities, and, like in Raqqa, the Americans destroyed the city. And then the Western media has the audacity to talk about barrel bombs and that sort of thing, when, we saw the sort of devastation, and I saw firsthand the devastation and destruction that the Americans created. But the Western media won't touch this sort of thing because, contrary to what some people think, the Western media is not free, and it's not owned by the people. It does not represent the voices of the people. It represents the state and the elites who control the states, whether it's the United States or its close allies in Europe.
Yeah, exactly. You raised such a wide array of brilliant points there, and One of them is about the indiscriminate bombing that they always claim Syria and Russia are undertaking, while conveniently ignoring the destruction that you just underscored, both inside of Syria and Iraq. I mean, not to mention all the other countries that the U.S. has invaded, but coming afterwards and then claiming that the U.S., which created not just the power vacuum and the conditions for ISIS, but then aided and abetted them and did nothing about them, to come, as Trump did 2 days ago and on many other occasions, and say that he single-handedly defeated ISIS. I mean, it's quite frightening how people swallow this up and they have no clue whatsoever about the reality on the ground, and they just believe it for what it is. And not just, I'm not just talking about Trump's base, but even the general public, the people in the West, they believe all of this nonsense that's regurgitated by the media. It is really quite frightening.
Palestinian Christians, were they ever supported by the U.S. government? Most of them have left the country because of the decades of suppression. In Syria and Iraq, it was Iran, alongside, of course, the Syrian army, and Hezbollah that protected the Christians, the Druze, and other minorities. Of course, they defended themselves as well. It was the Syrian army is a mix of all people from all ethnic and religious backgrounds in the country in Syria. And in Iraq, again, the Iranians helped defeat ISIS and prevent them from destroying Christian communities. I visited Christian communities when we were going to Mosul immediately after the liberation, and there are, and at that time especially during the fighting, there were Christian troops as a part of the popular mobilization forces. The Hashd al-Sha'bi includes Christians, it includes Yazidis, it includes Kurds, it includes Sunnis. There are all sorts of troops from all backgrounds in Iraq. But the Americans like to, and when we went to Mosul, for example, and again, this was like 2 days after the city was liberated, we were going through areas that were controlled by the Hashd, but they were Sunni. I was going with like commanders, and they were all very friendly, very close, and we'd go and visit different commanders and different tribes, and it was very interesting. And Iraq and Syria, both fantastic countries, and I'm sure one day things will get a lot better. But the audacity of the American government and the Western media to claim that the United States has played a positive role in Iraq or Syria is extraordinary. But it's sort of like Libya. They destroyed Libya, and now the only thing, they never talk about who created the mess in Libya. Or in Yemen, for example, the Saudis began this war with a green light from Washington.